Hi, my name is Christopher Malcolm, and welcome to Movable Canvas, where we talk about cinema, arts, culture, and where those three things sometimes intersect. In today's episode, we'll be looking at some of that old-time religion, or at least someone who claims to believe in old-time religion, with the 1960s Best Picture nominee, Elmer Gantry. Religion in the movies make strange bedfellows. I say that the perception outside of Hollywood would be that people who make the movies are largely atheists without faith. And while the arts in general may lend itself more to people with a tendency to eschew traditional authoritarian forms of structures, I think an actual survey of the religious beliefs of those working in the movies are probably not that far off from the general population. Yet outside the recent growth of very specific faith-based film genres, most films try to be generally agnostic in their approach to faith on screen. This is not a rejection of religion. This is simple common sense. Movies are for everyone, and not everyone shares your set of religious belief. And of course, even if I respect the role that religion plays in someone else's life, that doesn't mean that I'm paying for a sermon when I plunk down my money to see a thriller on opening weekend. As a filmmaker, you're looking for commonalities between people as opposed to evangelizing for one specific point of view. Then there are other filmmakers who dive right in and take faith head on. It's been a while since the last time I watched Elmer Gantry. Interestingly enough, it was my father who introduced me to the film. I say that's interesting because my father, you might be surprised to know, hates movies. Well, it's less that he hates movies and more that he hates sitting in one place for 2 hours at a time. If I were to estimate, I'd say he probably sat through less than 24 movies in his lifetime. At least half of them were forced upon him by our own family gatherings during the holidays. So it was a surprise during my early days of film study when I was starting to just kind of get into classic film to discover that he did, in fact, have a few favorite films. At the top of his list was one called Elmer Gantry. In hindsight, I guess I probably shouldn't have been so surprised that a film about a revival house preacher would top my father's list. My grandmother, my father's mother, was a minister in the holiness movement. She was one of those evangelists who went around holding revivals and tents on the side of the road to try to bring in more people to the faith. My father is also a very religious person, as are most members of my family. I won't go deeply into my own faith here. This is not for that. But, well, let's just say that religion is one of the things that I definitely did not inherit from my parents. So the very few times that my father has suggested I see a particular film, it tends to be a thinly veiled attempt to get me to watch that film. And on some level, I'm sure he thinks that me seeing that film will help me see the light. Elmer Gantry, The Apostle, and other films where religion takes the lead roles are some of the only ones he'll actually willingly sit down and watch with me. On a side note, his other favorite film is the decidedly less religion-based Midnight Cowboy, so go figure. But despite my clarity on my father's thinly veiled intentions, I'm a cinephile first and foremost, so I'll watch any movie. A film doesn't have to be a one-to-one reflection of my own religious beliefs to be great, so I promptly set up the projector and screened the 1960 film about a con man who sees religion as his salvation, or perhaps more accurately, sees religion as his golden ticket. Burt Lancaster is an interesting actor. It's funny because when I think of my list of favorite actors of all time, I rarely put Burt Lancaster at the top of that list. But when I think of some of my favorite films of all time, Burt Lancaster tends to show up in a lot of them. In trying to assess that coincidence, I think it comes down to a unique skill that Lancaster had that went far beyond his square jaw and overflowing charisma. Burt Lancaster, like Tom Cruise and other stars with longevity, knew how to pick his projects. Very rarely was he in a bad film. As a result, his filmography is littered with hit after hit, from Here to Eternity, The Swimmer, The Killers, Field of Dreams. Elmer Gantry, for which he won the Best Actor Academy Award in 1961, may be his pinnacle. In the very first scene, we introduced to Elmer in a pool house. He's working the crowd, the life of the party. He's technically a traveling salesman, but for Elmer, the focus is on the joy he derives from his preternatural ability to sell anything as opposed to any particular product. When a set of nuns enter the pool hall and try to kind of garner donations from an uninterested patronage, Elmer sees the moment as an opportunity to show off his skills. He takes the donation pot from the nuns and starts working the room. When plain salesmanship fails, Elmer turns to the old pastiche of an energetic preacher, complete with passages from the Bible, in order to manipulate the crowd of drunkards into filling the pot to the brim. This opening scene is instructive because it sets the stage for the entire story. The fact that Elmer has that knowledge of Scripture just on hand at all times suggests some connection to the church. No matter how slick a salesman you may be, to get to that level of preachership, It hints at very least that there's some background rooted in actual time spent as a member of a congregation. But that scene also makes it clear that this little performance is as much of a game for his own enjoyment as it is any attempt to actually spread the word of God. Elmer is a charlatan, a demagogue. He loves nothing more than the sound of his own voice. He's got legitimate charm, and he's one of those people who can walk into any bar, church, or living room in town and walk out 5 minutes later with a following. He's got the gift of gab, and he wields it like a weapon. Now, one thing I had forgotten until I was actually rewatching the film this weekend was that the movie actually opens with a disclaimer. A scroll appears before the film that warns the audiences that its intention is not to denounce religion itself, but rather to shine a light on specific bad actors who would manipulate religion for their own gains. Kind of a pre-buttal to dull any attacks for the religious right that might have picketed outside the theaters otherwise. So let me mimic that disclaimer here. The things I will talk about in this essay are about the film itself and the characters depicted, so please don't take anything I say here as a statement about a particular faith or its practitioners. Actually, just as interesting as the movie itself, one of the things I wanted to do was do a bit of research and trying to figure out exactly what would have attracted Hollywood to this particular story in the first place. Movies tend to come in waves with certain genres or topics inexplicably popular at certain times. Film noir, for instance, grew out of a very specific post-war World War II period where returning veterans were coming home to a world that felt much darker than the ones they had left. Names like Mickey Cohen ran organized crime syndicates in Southern California and would have been in constant contact with Hollywood after dark. Put those things together, and it helps explain the appeal of writers like Raymond Chandler or Dashiell Hammett at the time. Elmer Gantry, which was released in 1960, was nominated for an Academy Award in 1961 alongside another film about religion, Inherit the Wind, starring Spencer Tracy, that placed its focus on the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, in which Clarence Darrow faced off against William Jennings Bryan in a case about a small southern town's fight over teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. Elmer Gantry itself was based on a novel from the 1920s from writer Sinclair Lewis. He would also go on to pen several books that got turned into movies, including Dodsworth probably being the most famous. And of course, Los Angeles, home to Hollywood, was no stranger to religious spectacle. In 1923, Canadian-born Amy Semple McPherson made Southern California her home base. She built a 5,300-seat megachurch that would dwarf the fantastical Church by the Sea built by the female protagonist of our film, Sister Sharon Falconer. Semple McPherson was one of the first religious figures to kind of master radio broadcasting, and she understood that the spectacle of religion was just as important as the salvation aspect. Her mysterious disappearance or purported kidnapping in 1926, which may have just actually been a cover for a romantic getaway, was no doubt a big inspiration for the plot of our film. When our film was made, it was also around the time of the breakout of evangelist Billy Graham in 1949 with his Los Angeles crusade, which made him into a national figure and once again thrust religion into the mainstream. So no doubt religion and an evangelist in particular were very much in the public conversation in the late 50s, early 60s, when Elmer Gantry would have first hit the theaters. But as we discussed earlier, a great film has to do more than preach to the choir. There are a lot of great faith-based movies being produced today, but their ticket buyers are almost exclusively made up of people who already share the same faith. So how does Elmer Gantry go from being a story specific only to purveyors of a single religion to become a universal story with relevance across the moral spectrum? At its core, Elmer Gantry is about a type of person we all know too well, even more so at a time this episode is being produced when authoritarians and demagogues not only exist, but have assumed the highest levels of leadership in governments around the world. Snake oil salesmen who would have been laughed off the stage in previous generations have somehow made their way into the halls of power, and we are now discovering the consequences of that in real time. But the thing about true charisma, a true con man or con woman can get people to do things they never thought they would do in 1,000 years. Those with the power to build a cult of personality around themselves, like Elmer Gantry, can cause others to temporarily lose sight of themselves, or perhaps more accurately, they reveal the demons that were already inside. Sister Sharon Falconer is a prime example. She was doing just fine before Elmer Gantry arrived in her life. She was leading a powerful but decidedly small-scale evangelical movement, building up her own fame and fortune among the proletariat through her roadside revivals. There are 1,000,001 Sister Sharon Falconers throughout the rural communities of the world. She spreads the gospel, but one can't help but to wonder if her aim is to bring patrons closer to God or bring herself closer to her own goals. Sister Sharon Falconer's goals in Elmer Gantry are made tangible when she confesses to him that her real goal is to build a cathedral by the sea. Of course, even if Sister Falconer puts on the facade of the untarnished prophet, a great salesman like Elmer Gantry, well, their strongest skill is always seeing through the outer shell and being able to rapidly assess a target's strengths and vulnerabilities. And Sister Falconer is, behind all the piety, a woman, and he's a man. A man with inexhaustible charm and a kind of swagger that appeals to even the most God-fearing women. His seduction of her is as clear as it is complex. On one hand, the initial flirtation with her is clearly a way to kind of worm himself deeper into her movement and build up his own standing. He sees an opportunity and he takes it. She is, however, played by Gene Simmons, a beautiful woman. So while his motivations are clear, it's also believable to her and to us that his feeling for her may actually be genuine. Reeled in by his perceived sincerity, she lets down her guard. Literally. One of my favorite visual cues in the film is how her own relationship to modesty changes throughout the film. In an early scene, she's backstage after one of the shows and she's having a conversation with her business manager while she's changing her clothes. She makes a point of moving behind a privacy screen as she disrobes. Later, after Gantry has completed his seduction and made her a full woman, so to speak, we again see the business manager come into the door. Post-coital, the seemingly enlivened Sister Sharon Falconer casually opens the door in her revealing slip, needing to be reminded by her manager at this point now that her own womanhood is on display. By the way, yet another visual moment that really stands out to me in this film is when they're in the woods and Gantry finally gets the preacher into bed, or into the grass, I guess would be more specific. It's one of those moments where the lady doth protest too much and Gantry can kind of see through her protestations that what she really wants is for him to take her to bed. It's a night scene lit by slashes of moonlight, and Gantry takes her by the hand, smiles with amusement as her words say no, but her eyes say yes, and gently leads her from the light into the literal darkness. Smash cut to the next scene where the outer sheen of her pretense is gone, and well, we can fill in the gaps, and we know exactly what happened in those woods. Gantry himself may also not be quite what he seems. The all-powerful con man seems without gaps in his armor until the arrival of a prostitute, one Miss Lulu Baines, halfway through the film. To be specific, Shirley Jones as Lulu Baines doesn't appear on screen until the hour and 15-minute mark. But what an entrance she makes. Usually when I think of Shirley Jones, I think of titles like The Music Man or Oklahoma. I admit I wasn't really quite prepared when she hit the screen as the scantily clad Lulu Baines. I mean, gee whiz, no doubt why she was one of the arrows that could actually pierce Gantry's armor. But like Gantry and Sister Sharon Falconer, Lulu Baines is more than just a striking outer facade. In fact, the strength of the film is that it makes room for its potentially one-sided characters to make decisions that seem to run counter to their own self-professed image. Shirley Jones enters the film giving that great barely coded speech to her fellow prostitutes at the brothel about back in the day when Gantry put the fear of God into her again and again, all night long. As the story progresses, it becomes clear that Jones' character portrays herself as this hardened lady of the night, but in reality, she's a woman who the freewheeling Gantry seduced when she was presumably underage and in love with him. He left town and left her with the fallout. Essentially, he ruined her life. When he re-enters her life through a case of sheer coincidence, when he leads a publicity raid on her brothel, both her love and hatred for Gantry are both rekindled. Both play a big part in the scenes to come, and his guilt over how he treated her as well as his genuine attraction to her proved to be his Achilles heel. The businessmen in the town can fund Gantry's hustle. Sister Falconer is decidedly attractive, but she also represents a financial windfall beyond the sexual entanglements. But Lulu Baines, she can't give him anything but trouble. The fact that she's the one person that Gantry can't bring himself to hustle deepens their relationship and each of their characters. What makes Elmer Gantry so great is that it refuses to paint in black and white, only shades of gray. Jim Lefferts, the skeptical journalist played by Arthur Kennedy, is something of our audience surrogate. Even true believers can be skeptical of the motivations of some potentially false prophets. His continued examination and doubt about Gantry and Falconer's movement mirror our own. But like him, our understanding of the characters evolves over the course of the film. You know, it's mentioned during the film, but it reveals itself in life. People don't want prophets to be human beings. Once a hero has secured our backing, our minds can jump through 1,000,001 hoops to ensure that no speckle of dirt could ever land on their collar. This is part of how hucksters get us to believe in their lies against our own better judgment. We believe in them, and thus, whatever they say must be true. When presented with hard evidence of reality, we push back even harder, as if honesty were a personal assault. For the huckster, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They lie openly, and they get what they want. Then people believe them, and the huckster continues to repeat the lie. Pretty soon, the lie has been repeated enough to where people start to take it as fact. The huckster, aware of his or her own power, repeats this pattern now going forward. They lie with impunity, knowing full well that their followers will believe anything they say. They could literally kill someone, and their supporters will somehow blame the person who's been shot. Elmer Gantry takes us into a world of religion, but it's not a film specifically about faith. I'd argue that both of our leads, both Gantry and Sister Falconer, have somewhat tenuous relationships with pure faith throughout the film. It's hard to know just how much of their own BS they actually believe and how much is just a tool to help them reach their personal goal. Even towards the end of the film, where a deaf man comes on stage at Falconer's megachurch hoping to be healed, I'm not 100% sure if that's actually a real patron or just an actor she's planted there to make a show. And that in itself is the key to being a con man, or a con woman. Confusing your audience with just enough sincerity, pitted against an overabundance of fabrication to the point where we struggle to know what's actually true. In another strange case of coincidence, Sinclair Lewis, who wrote the source material for Elmer Gantry, also wrote another book called It Can't Happen Here in 1935. That one, which was never actually made into a major film, centered around a fascist demagogue who wins the American presidency. Essentially, it's an authoritarian playbook as a warning novel from the same man who admittedly brought us one of the greatest con men ever presented on screen. Thanks again for watching another episode of Movable Canvas. If you like these kind of deep dive discussions, be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. I'd really appreciate that. I usually post a new essay about once per month where we talk about the best that Hollywood and the rest of the world have to offer. And please do leave me a comment. Have you seen Elmer Gantry? What did you think of Sister Sharon Falconer? Was she genuine in her beliefs or just a con artist like Elmer Gantry? One scene in the film that I found particularly effective in that regard was the fire scene, where the two's opposing reactions to the fire, I think, do suggest something about their true belief system. And how do you ultimately feel about Elmer Gantry? Were any of his words actually reflective of his emotions, or was it all just one big con to see if he could win the game? I look forward to engaging with you in the comments below. Until then, thanks for watching, and have a great day.